Merry post-Christmas, my Acers, and it's good to see you again. So, I wanted to, first of all, wish you and your family and everyone the happiest end of the year and the best beginning of the new year. Second, I kind of had to show this because this is cool because I was a boy in the 80s and into the early 90s. So, G.I. Joe was like one of the coolest cartoons that ever was when I was a kid. And so I got this from my son for Christmas, and it is one of the coolest toys I think I've ever gotten in my life. It was like, I didn't get many of these new, so it was really cool. But this is what I got for Christmas. This is a Hiss tank. But those of you who are familiar with the Hiss tank will notice a couple things that are different and slightly off about this. First of all, this gray up here, and second, this big cannon up here. Now, it does come with Baroness. She's pretty cool, and I just realized I'm just as pasty as her face, but there's Baroness. And then it comes with her ammo. She even came in a blister pack, but since it had multiple languages on it, it wasn't quite as cool as the original. If it had been the original card, I might not have taken her out of her package, but let me pull these out. I gotta show you, these are cool. So she comes with a base, so she can stand on a base. A rifle. She can't hold in both hands because you can't quite flex her that way. And her head doesn't turn very well. Because that hair kind of sticks to the back of her neck and it won't let her head turn. And a Cobra backpack. Because she's an intelligence officer. Okay, so as to the Hiss. This is where it gets cool. Because this, let me just show you it first. So that the cannon comes off, the big cannon. Man, I'm even going to, this is what the original Hiss looked like, pretty much, except it was all black. And then I'm going to pull off these guns on the turret. And I'm going to pop this part up. And, oh, the back fell off. I'm going to pop this part up. Bring up the front piece. And yes, folks. Yes, my friends. Even a 46-year-old guy can get excited about a toy because this toy happens to be not only any toy, but it happens to be the Megatron Hiss tank battle, Hiss battle tank thing, the crossover G.I. Joe Transformers thing. Now Hasbro, who makes G.I. Joe and Transformers, also happens to make everybody else's favorite role-playing game of Dungeons and Dragons, because they bought Wizards of the Coast a number of years ago. Okay, so now I'm to this point. Pop his treads out. Put his arms up. Put the treads down. And okay, gotta get those in place. But anyway, so yeah, Hasbro. Well, because some of you might not know some of the history of role-playing game, and I don't know all of it, I admit. But many of you might know already that Dungeons and Dragons is the OG when it comes to role-playing games. And it's a good game, and it's come along a long, long way over the last 50 years almost. Well, it'll be 50, not to, in 20, not in 23, but 2024. So role-playing gaming, as we have done it here for a while, that came about in 1974. So, like I said, 50 years in 2024. And role-playing gaming was kind of a novel concept. And what is it, of course? It's that opportunity to, because, it came from wargaming, tabletop miniatures wargaming. So it's kind of interesting that that's where backpack piece down, and this, and then I can put his thing on here. So wargaming led to our hobby when a couple guys, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, decided, hey, wouldn't it be cool if just instead, because I mean that's actually where hit points comes from too. Hit points comes from the idea of you're actually counting how many units are basically taken out, and miniature was representative of unit or part of a unit versus representing a single character. Anyway, here's the transformed Megatron. Ah ha ha ha. And you can see that actually this is one of the best practical ones I think I've ever seen. But I had to show this to you guys because this is just cool. This is just stinking cool. Any 80s kid worth their salt is gonna just go nuts over this. Anyway, but I tend to keep them in this his form because then I can keep Baroness and put her guns away and stuff. Anyway, so role-playing gaming started when Gygax and Arneson said, hey, you know this unit here, this elf unit here, which they were archers in the fantasy battle game that they were playing. They're like, what's the story of one of them? Or kind of, that was kind of the idea. And so it became what we know today as role-playing gaming. They went through a lot of iterations and ups and downs and friendships and dissolving of friendships and just all sorts of, they kind of were, and it was just like any other industry. They had to figure out how things worked. And so they did. They figured out, and they got a good system, and it went through. There was Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and Dungeons and Dragons Basic and all this other stuff that was Dungeons and Dragons. And Dungeons and Dragons has been pretty darn cool. Some of the other companies out there aren't even around anymore. Like, at least as far as game producers, there was one called Tunnels and Trolls, done by Flying Buffalo Games. I'm reading a history on it. I think I've shown it to you guys on the channel here before. But there were other games that started coming out afterwards. And, like, for example, in England, to save on shipping costs, they just printed the games over there in England. And that company that printed them for Tactical Studies Rules, TSR, which was Arneson and Gygax's company, was a company called Games Workshop. And Games Workshop is the company that today still produces Warhammer 40K, which many of us end up playing at some point in our gaming careers. I did. Or Warhammer and Warhammer 40K. Sorry, I was tapping my mic. Anyway, Warhammer and Warhammer 40K are both, they're excellent games, going back to that tabletop miniatures origin of role-playing gaming anyway. And it's not, there's no problem with that. Actually, that magazine that Games Workshop puts out, White Dwarf, happens to be one of the oldest continuous gaming productions ever. And it used to have a lot of stuff about role-playing games in it. And that was one of the cool things about it. Now, during that time, you get lots of other game companies that come and go. And, I mean, I'm not even through the book on the 70s yet. But older than TSR, as far as game companies went, you had the game company Avalon Hill, which they also when I was a teenager in '91, when I got into role playing, really, um, they produced. Um, they were the publication company for a cute little silly game called Tales from the Floating Vagabond, which, in my opinion, is still one of the funniest and silliest games ever made. I love it. I will probably try a way to find a way to savage it because if I haven't already told you guys, savaging is where you take a game or a setting or something like that, and you make it into a Savage World setting that can be played using the Savage World's rules. And most systems and games and things can be savaged. But the thing is that games are games like that are they are they feel the way they feel because of what they are. They are completely like, okay, for example, um, Dungeons and Dragons feels like Dungeons and Dragons because it's Dungeons and Dragons. It has the biggest change that ever really happened in the history of Dungeons and Dragons was when they got rid of a system called THACO they used to have. And THACO was to hit armor class 0, because it used to be a thing of the lower your armor class was, the better it was. So that was, and it made sense. THACO made sense when we had our armor classes that the lower they were, the better they were. But as time's gone on, they in third edition got rid of THACO, and they just realized, and that's kind of where the D20 system was born. And it just kind of made it more sense to just say, okay, the higher the number, the better the higher the number, the better the result. And that makes a lot more sense to a lot more people. So, that's where THACO went. And third edition of D&D, which is what got me back into gaming in a lot of ways. Because, I mean, I still had... I had... that was like 2000. I had... let's see. I had the three core rule books, the Player's Guide, the GM's Guide, and the Monster's Manual. I had those. And actually, their Psionics Handbook is not bad. It's one of my favorites. And I'll have to do a whole episode on Psionic Handbooks because Psionics is always, like I said in previous videos, and I'll say it again, it's always been one of my favorite things. But anyway, so TSR, they kept putting out stuff, and I played original Dungeons and Dragons. I played actually some first edition stuff. I played some second edition of Advanced D&D, and that Advanced D&D was in reference to basic Dungeons and Dragons, and there's the red box, and everybody's got experiences with that. I mean, my parents actually wouldn't let me play the red box and stuff like that because it was satanic. They'd heard it somewhere. Some Baptist preacher in the South, from what I understand, kept going on about it. My parents had heard it about that, but and then they'd also, of course, heard the legend of the steam tunnels, where the kid up at the University of Michigan had disappeared into the steam tunnels, and he had thought he was really a warrior with a sword, and it was just silly. And it was my friend Tracy Hickman who was one of the people who helped end the satanic panic of the 80s. So that's when I got into it. I had played around a little bit with Choose Your Own Adventure books, and I loved those. There was actually a whole string of them from Dungeons and Dragons too. But I couldn't get those from the bookmobile or the library anymore after my parents found out that I was reading them. And it took me a long time to get to a point where I could dare to defy my parents on that. So, anyway, the short version of this now is that because I actually wrote a paper on this in college, is that TSR started sliding downhill, and now that I've read the other book, there's a whole bunch of bad business decisions that were made and things like that put it in to a point that Wizards of the Coast came along and bought TSR. Wizards of the Coast, of course, their big thing was that they made the card game Magic the Gathering, which I've talked about before as well. And then because they had the card game for Pokemon, whereas Hasbro out in Rhode Island, they had the video game for Pokemon. They wanted to have all of Pokemon, so they bought Wizards of the Coast. And so Hasbro has been making Dungeons and Dragons for a while now. Many of you who play Magic might remember that there was a recent set that brought Dungeons and Dragons archetypes and characters and things like that into Magic. And I guess it's kind of gone the other way too. There's some stuff from Magic, like a source book or something you can get for Dungeons and Dragons that is Magic stuff. So there you go. But I was at the game store last night for our weekly team gaming, and I realized that they had a Magic set in there that had Transformers in it. And I was like, wait a minute. And then I paused for a second. I was like, oh yeah, that's right. Because Hasbro's been making action figures since I was very young, before I could really play with them. And actually at that time, the big company to beat was Kenner, because Kenner had Star Wars. And when I was an older boy and had bags of G.I. Joes and bags of Star Wars guys, and I wasn't playing with the Star Wars guys, I foolishly gave all my Star Wars figures to the Deseret Industries, which is our local thrift store chain, because I wasn't going to play with them anymore. And the truth be told, the reason why is because I liked the articulation on the G.I. Joes, because their elbows could bend and then they could rotate on the newer ones. But if you got some real old OG ones, their elbows don't rotate. They don't rotate on the arm here. And then there was they had so many cooler things. I mean, nothing's cooler than the Millennium Falcon playset, but I couldn't afford that. I was a poor kid. But I'll tell you this much: a 99-cent GI Joe, or they got up to like $1.50, and got those over at the hardware store. What was it called? It was a multiple kind of store, but it was a hardware store primarily down on the main floor. But upstairs they had a toy section, and I would go up there with my hard-earned $1.50, $2, or whatever it was, and I would get me a new GI Joe there all the time. And Cash's Western Auto, that's what it was. So it wasn't just a hardware store; it was also an automotive store, and it was right next to Kohler's, which was a grocery store, and actually one of the places I had one of my first jobs. I won't tell you about my very first job because it was a bad job, and I don't want to vilify the people who did it any more than they vilified themselves. So, anyway, I'm grateful for the experience. That's the thing. And I'm going to take a pause here to kind of give a PSA. You're going to go through hard things in your life. Life is not 100% joy and fun. Life isn't even 50% joy and fun. So that's why we enjoy the role-playing game moments when we get them, because life has its hardships, and it's going to be hard. And you're going to make mistakes, and you're going to do the wrong thing at the wrong time, but you have to forgive yourself. You have to try to not go back and make that same mistake again, and you have to move on. That's what life is. You can make plans, and you can try and control your life to a degree. You can. Life happens when you make other plans, and just the world happens to you, and you suddenly are not where you thought you were going to be. But that's okay, because you're still here. You're learning something. Ask yourself as you're going through it, what can I learn right now? Be grateful for what you're experiencing, because that gratitude is really how you will get through it. I mean, we just had somebody come look at our house yesterday, and they didn't like it because they said it smelled funny. And I have been outside and back in. I've made sure I sniff the carpets and things like that. There's no real smell at our house. And we have other people who don't live here who don't smell our smells all the time who have said that our house doesn't smell. So, whatever. Because when I get my new house, this background here is going to disappear and I'm going to have a cool game room slash office slash everything that is going to be just my place for playing games and doing my job. And that'll be it. It will be mine. I will have a room in a house. Yay! I mean, right now, the house is my wife's, and that's fine. I get spaces like this one down here. This is mine. And she doesn't come down here very often. As a matter of fact, down here in the basement, we just had my attic kid move in. He's kind of the blonde son we didn't have, and he's my son's best friend, and he just had to get out of his house. And sometimes you do have to just get away from what's happening in life. So when you get a moment, when you get 3 hours or 4 hours to play a role-playing game and pretend you're somebody else for 3 to 4 hours, or let your friends pretend they're somebody else while you run the game, seeing the joy on their faces, grab those moments, put them in your memory. That's American Sign Language for remember, to like really drill it in your head. Do it because it's so awesome. So anyway, back to Hasbro. They own Dungeons and Dragons. They own Magic the Gathering. They own Transformers. They own G.I. Joe. They own Star Wars now. They bought that when Kenner stopped doing Star Wars. I mean, and they also own Play School, Milton Bradley, Parker Brothers, just about every major board game company out there. But there's enough other game companies out there that they have competition. And the thing is that that's the other thing about competition. And this is the reason why I welcome Dungeons and Dragons players. I want to have a table of D&D going for Ace. I want to invite them to come in and play and have a great time. Because ultimately, if somebody else wants to have a different kind of fun than what I see as fun, that's okay. And it's okay for them to be wrong. I'm not saying Dungeons and Dragons is wrong. I'm just saying it's okay for other people to be wrong. You can let other people be wrong. And when you are able to just take a breath and not fight for what you think is the only right way, because you have facts even, don't fight it. Just let them be wrong. Now, like I said, Dungeons and Dragons is not wrong. I have fun with Dungeons and Dragons. I have a blast with Dungeons and Dragons. Would I ever want to game master it? Probably not. I have fun with my monthly Dungeons and Dragons game. And maybe I'll learn to run it eventually. Because game mastering is game mastering. You use the same tools, techniques, and trades that we use when we're running Savage Worlds to run Dungeons and Dragons, or Cyberpunk, or any other number of things. I have a young friend, he's excited about running Cyberpunk for our table on a Tuesday night. And you know what? That's absolutely wonderful. I loved playing Cyberpunk. I used to try to run 7th Sea, which is written by a guy whom I hope to become friends with someday, John Wick. Not to be confused with the movie John Wick, which you guys shouldn't be watching anyway. Unless your parents let you. But that's between you and your parents. I'm not your parent, and so I didn't let my kids watch it until they were over 16, almost 17 years old. So I do not endorse it for you if you're under the age of 18. Because I, as the grand poobah of, and that's a really old throwback. That's even older than me. So it's even before my time, but I saw it in the reruns. But anyway, since I am the main face and voice of Ace role-playing games, I need to say, I do not endorse you watching R-rated movies. I do not endorse you breaking promises to parents. I do not endorse you disobeying your parents. But each of us is in our own situation and in our own circumstances. But know this, until you reach 18, 19, 20, even 25 for males, your prefrontal cortex, which is a part of your brain that's inside, because this is like your brain and it sits over the front. This is your decision making tool and your understanding tool. It's not fully developed until about 25. So, since that's not fully developed until you're about 25, don't make any major life decisions. Don't make any decisions that you're going to regret later. Just know that you are amazing and special just the way you are right now. Because it's like TSR owning Dungeons and Dragons. They have made it big and special, and it holds the major share of the market. And it's special and good for what it is. And you are special and good for who and what you are. Your value was already set long ago. Nothing you do will change that value. So forgive yourself for your past mistakes. Encourage future mistakes where you learn. And know that we here at Ace Role Playing Games, I love you. And we are glad to have you as part of our group. We're glad that you're making friends. We're glad that you are encouraging growth in your own mind, because that prefrontal cortex, as it develops and you learn how to problem solve and make decisions and critically think, it's going to be stronger when it finishes developing. You're amazing. And that's why I compare each of us to our own character in our own role-playing game. But it's the real thing. And each of us has a chance to do something amazing in this world. Even if it's just to be kind to a stranger one day. You can do amazing things. You guys can tell amazing stories. And I wish you a very happy new year. Until next time, this is Mason with Ace Role Playing Games, telling you to game for good, and I'll see you next time.